Hi, I'm Simon Furman. I'm the writer on the original Marvel G1 series and more recently The War Within for Dreamwave.
Hi, I'm Andrew Wildman. I was the artist for the final year of the original Marvel G1 comic book, and more recently worked with Simon again on Dreamwave's The War Within 2.
I got into it back in 1985. I was just a jobbing freelance writer looking for work, and I got introduced to the editor of Transformers UK, Sheila Cranner, who was just at the time looking for UK writers to produce original material. They were basically running out of American material to reprint, and they needed to pad out in between with UK stories. So, I just basically was given a guideline of a few characters, the general overview, a few American issues, and told to come up with some stories that were self-contained and didn't impact on the main US story. So we had to make sure that we didn't kill off characters, use characters that weren't in the US story, and we had to pretty much second guess what the Americans were going to do. So that was a 1985, and since then I've worked on the UK comic, the US comic, Beast Wars TV series, the Dreamwave series, Transformers almost on and off for 20 years.
My first involvement with Transformers was when I first started drawing comics for Marvel UK, and I was working on Thundercats. I think was the thing that I was working on mostly for a particular editor, and I was taking work into the office, and in the Marvel offices then in London, there was the editor who was doing Thundercats, and then next to him at the desk was the editor who was doing Transformers. And I handed over my Thundercats work, and the editor, who was Simon on the Transformers book, said, "Do you want to draw some toy robots?" And I was like, "Well, no, not really. Does it pay well?" "Yeah, all right then." And so I did, and it just kind of started from there, and carried on through the UK stuff, and then into America with Simon writing pretty much all of it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, when I moved on to the US comic book, we were immediately sort of just picking up from the previous team. So we had an artist called Jose Delbo doing the pencils. And, I was so used to working with the UK artists, I was looking for any opportunity to bring the guys I'd worked with in the UK on board for the US. So as soon as we needed a fill-in for Jose, we brought Jeff Sr. into the mix, first of all. And Jeff did a whole bunch of US issues. But when it came to bringing on a regular artist to replace Jose, Jeff just couldn't commit. He was busy doing some other stuff for Marvel UK. So my immediate thought was Andrew, who, sort of I'd worked with many times on the UK comic. And it just so happened that we, with a little sort of wrinkle of almost not getting Andrew on it, and finally we did. There was a toss-up between Andrew and an American artist. And the editor, Don Daly, wanted the American artist, and I wanted Andrew. And thankfully the American artist did one issue and made such a hash of it that, Andrew was a shoo-in after that.
Yeah, I mean, they asked me to try out for the book, and I did a 2-page sample spread. They said, put some stuff together. I don't even know if they supplied any kind of script. I think it was just like a rough outline. Draw 2 pages of kind of this stuff happening. And I did it, and I did it the way that I was going to do it the way that I'd always drawn the British stuff, which was the thing that people kind of know me for, which was to make them look more organic. They got expressions and all this kind of thing. And the assistant editor on the American books, I think, suggested that I make them look more metallic. So I did it that way and sent in the sample, and they turned it down. They said no, they wanted to go with this other guy. Well, when this other artist who they had picked for this particular issue, for whatever reason, they didn't quite work out for them, they gave it back to me, and I thought, right, I've actually got it now, so I'm not going to make them look metallic. I'm just going to go back to what I know, and off I went with organic looking faces and teeth and everything, and that was my take on Transformers.
And pretty much I tend to think of that as my sort of the best run on Transformers. We really hit our stride when Andrew was on board. It just seemed to all my, I was getting into the pace of the US storyline. Andrew gave it that kind of consistency throughout. And, it was just a real shame when the series was cancelled at issue 80. It was just like, no, we've got so much more we want to do. what we found was, once the original Transformers movie came out, the animated film in 1985, and we got that storyline and those characters, we were able to go off on real wild tangents because we knew that the American comic wasn't going to be featuring those characters. I mean, the main problem we had was, if we were doing a story about the Dinobots, we had to know where to leave them and in what condition, and how that was going to run on into the next batch of US stories. But with the time travelling characters from the movie, what we found was that we could take Galvatron, say, and really just tell a whole story about him, even if we killed him off at the end. You know, we knew that it was never going to be a factor in the US story, so we were able to start doing these 10 or 11 or more part stories that just ran off on a whole different tangent. And as long as we ended up with Optimus Prime back where he was in time for the next American story, we could do that. And we just used to see which characters the focus had moved off on the US book and pick up on those. I was a little wary at first when I first started issue 56. I was a little bit, well, I better just do it very much the way the Americans have been doing it and use the same characters, keep it nice and focused, involve lots of human characters. Anyway, it took me about 4 issues to think, I'm going to throw all that out the window and do what I was doing on the UK, which was to present this big epic battle with gods and, you know, sort of planet devouring big monsters all the way through it. And it was just so much more fun once, you know, I gave up the constraints of the American book. And I think the fans really sort of appealed to me, you know, appealed to what I was doing on that. In the case of Transformers, it was really rushed. I'd certainly written issue 77 when we found out that we had to wrap up by issue 80. So, you know, I mean, we literally just started off the next batch of post-big battle storylines. We started laying the seeds of about 3 or 4 different story arcs that suddenly we had to wrap up or bring to some sort of conclusion. So a lot of the things we had planned just immediately got thrown out or terminated or contracted. I mean, we just killed off Optimus Prime again in issue 75, and you know, the plan was he was going to be out of the comic for 10 issues or more. But, you know, we had to bring him back for issue 80. So suddenly he was just ridiculously quickly was back. And whole story arcs just had to be shrunk down. So it was a strange way to finish it off. It felt like we weren't giving it our best because it looked rushed. You know, with the best will in the world, trying to wrap up all these storylines in 3 issues was a killer, really.
It kind of felt like a party that had really, really kicked off, and you knew you were going to have a great time, and then suddenly somebody comes in and puts the lights on and says, "Get out!" You know, it's like, what's going on here? Because there was so much more that we wanted to do, but then you have to kind of work with that as a professional. You have to just accept it as it is and move on to the next project. And we've been lucky, in as much as this thing has come back again. If that had been completely it, you know, issue 80, bang, Transformers is dead, it would have always been a bit kind of, it was a shame we never had the opportunity to finish that, but in some ways, you know, it's moved on. So. And
it was the pattern, really, because with Generation 2, again, we got one story arc done, but we'd laid the seeds or the groundwork for the next story arc, which ended up just 1 page at the end of issue 12 of Generation 2, and then nothing. And you know, it was great for the fans because they did their fan fictions. They just ran with it as they wanted. And it was only when 3 years ago now, one of the UK conventions asked me to do a bit of technically fan fiction of my own to sell at the convention. So we came up with a little sort of novella called Alignment, which finished off the whole Generation 2 storyline. So that was great, and you know, one way or another, with most of this stuff, we've got another stab at it. We've got a chance to wrap it up, or just do it differently and over again. It was great when I first started working for Dreamwave. They really gave me a blank slate and just said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And you know, the thing I'd always wanted to do was this. There was this gulf of time between when the Civil War supposedly broke out on Cybertron and when they come to Earth. And I thought, well, nobody's done those stories. We've had little glimpses, the occasional reference thrown into a UK story and really just thrown in. And I thought it'd be great to standardise this, to come up with a complete Civil War timetable of the main events that happened. And there was just this massive gulf of time. If you believe the chronology, it's something like 6 or 7 million years past. And, you think, how much could have happened in that time? So, I think we condensed it a little bit, but it was great just to be able to pull out and say, we'll focus on that little bit of time there, then we'll jump forward and focus on that main battle or that confrontation. And slowly but surely we'll meet the point where they get into the Ark and fly to Earth.
Well, for me, with War Within, because it was the second part of the whole War Within series, Don Figueroa had already retro designed most of the characters, and I could look at what he'd done, the general feel of it. I kind of understood where the story was going, what the general idea was, that this was pre everything you ever knew of Transformers. And because Don had retro designed a lot of the characters, the reference was there, because his drawings were so detailed and his initial designs were so detailed that it was like working from whatever movie reference. So it was easy to do those characters. With the characters that I had to retro design, it was fairly easy to see his thought process, in as much as he'd taken maybe a G1 character and how he had thought backwards as to what this thing might have looked like under different circumstances. So you think, okay, right, so we take these elements, we take these basic shapes, we take the basic mode of transport of a particular character stroke vehicle or whatever, and just think about it in a slightly different way. And largely I still think you could do, as long as the proportions were still roughly the same, you can kind of do what you like when you're retro designing these things, because a lot of it is identified by the colour of the character. So as long as you give the right areas to get the right bits of colour on, I think a lot of them were kind of identified that way. So it was okay. It wasn't too much problem. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a story I've told many times at sort of conventions or whatever, where while I was doing Transformers, the only thing I ever wanted to do was to not do Transformers. But it was access to the whole kind of Marvel opportunity, really. So then the natural move for me was Transformers onto G.I. Joe. I was given that opportunity. I moved on to G.I. Joe. It was another sort of Hasbro property book, but it was real people. So I really enjoyed that. And then because of who the editors were on any given books, I moved from that on to, what did I do next? I can't remember. X-Men Adventures, yeah, and then onto a Spider-Man book and all sorts of things like that. So that was fantastic. Enjoyed my whole time working for Marvel, which was quite a number of years. But now I look back at it, because Transformers is still around, and I do feel as though Transformers was the most fun I had working on comics, because Simon's scripts were so wonderful. It just seemed really, really coherent, a really nice thing to do, and you knew that the people who were reading this stuff were not just reading it and liking it; they were just absolutely loving it and collecting it, and were so dedicated to the whole thing that you thought, well, then it really deserves my attention, and it was good. But yeah, there was a whole load of other stuff for Marvel. And what else did I do? I worked for a computer games company designing characters and vehicles and environments. Worked in animation, designing characters for kids' animated TV shows. All those kind of related industries. They all kind of fit together quite nicely. Bits of storyboarding, all that kind of thing.
For me, Transformers is strange because it kept finishing for me. I kept thinking, that's it. I'd done my time on Transformers. It was great fun, and now I can move on. And, there was a time when I sort of resented just being the guy who wrote Transformers. I wanted to be known for other things. I'd created characters like Death's Head and Dragon's Claws. I'd worked on comics like Alpha Flight and RoboCop and She-Hulk. So I'd done lots of other stuff, but everybody knew me for Transformers. So, when each time it came to a close, although I was sad, I thought, well, great, I can now focus on other things. But, Generation 1 finished, and then Generation 2 started a little bit later. Generation 2 finished, and then there was a sort of wilderness time in Transformers terms, I guess, of maybe 2 or 3 years, until we got invited out to one of the US BotCon conventions, which of course we didn't even know existed.
No.
We didn't know anything about Beast Wars, which was the new animated TV series and toy line. We just thought Transformers had finished. So we got invited out to this convention and met this fan base who we'd never met before. I mean, we just hadn't done anything like this before. I think for the US comic, I did a couple of comic store signings, and I'd met a few people coming in, and it was great to get feedback. But we had no idea, either of us, I think, that this had all continued in our absence, that people had gone on with their stories. They'd written their own fan fictions, they'd slavishly collected the toys, the internet was becoming prominent, so suddenly there were these big fan communities growing up. And as far back as 1994, I think, there'd been a Transformers convention happening in America. And we went to our first one in 1997 in Rochester, New York. And, we were just wowed by this 1,000 or so Transformers fans who came through the door over the weekend and just wanted to talk about Transformers, wanted to know about issue 60, panel 4, page 5.
And we'd forgotten everything.
We hadn't got a clue. We sat on these panels and sort of went, I'm not sure.
No idea, yeah.
So we went back again the next year. And, I'd definitely done my homework this time and gone back and read everything and thought about it, and so I was a little bit more prepared. But it was just interesting to see that it all carried on. We did some comics work for the convention. We did a couple of convention exclusive comics, which got us back into the swing of things. And from there, that pretty much led us into the Dreamwave era and everything, the whole retro 80s boom that happened in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. So it was all sort of, there was little intermittent gaps, but it really never went away at all. We just thought it had.
Yeah, it was us that went away.
Yeah. And the strange thing about Transformers is that it's kind of led me through my career. Each time I've started working on Transformers, it's opened another door. So, initially it was into Marvel UK, then into Marvel US, then into TV animation when I met Bob Forward at one of the BotCon conventions. Bob Forward was the script editor on the Beast Wars show. And we just got talking. He knew my name. He'd seen some of my work and just said, well, it'd be a great kick if you came on board, did one episode. And that led into a whole lot of other work with Bob Forward, not on Transformers, but I followed him around onto series like X-Men Evolution and Roswell Conspiracies and Dan Dare. So, it opened another door. And, the Dreamwave thing, likewise, has sort of kept me current in the industry, I guess. So... And, recently I met up with the producers of the live-action movie, and, whether that will lead to anything, I don't know, but it keeps moving my career along a stage. I mean, the funny thing is, I think most of what we've worked on throughout our careers has been either licensed or company-owned. It's only very recently we've started doing a lot of our own stuff for the Wild Fur. We've got our own little company. We've been working on our own product. We've been literally creating our own worlds, and it's been very liberating. But on the other hand, I've never really found a huge problem with working on licensed properties or company-owned properties. I mean, I've always tried to, be loyal to what has been set up, but not be too bound by it, especially with Transformers, where they came equipped with this backstory and the little tech specs for each character. And, you'd normally be able to take a couple of interesting ideas out of that, and then I'd just feel I had a license really to run with it in a completely different direction. And I guess if anything's characterised my comics work on it, it's just not being slavishly bound to what has already been laid down, whether in other comics or the toy boxes or whatever.
Well, I think Simon's happy as long as they give him enough characters to kill. But I mean, from an artist's point of view, we've said before that the that artists bring their own kind of interpretation to all these characters, but essentially you've got to follow the reference. They've got to be recognizable as these characters, whether that's Transformers or Spider-Man or whatever. And I've worked on other books and properties that have been more exacting, where the people who hold the license have said, no, it's really, really got to look this way. Not that it's just got to be recognizable, but it's got to look this way. And then the most exacting process is working in animation, because of the consistency you need while you're doing characters, designing a character, and then doing a turnaround of it, so you show it from all different angles. And once you've had the opportunity to do that, you realise how far these things can go, and how some things have to be line perfect so that they look exactly the same. They're always drawn the same. They always look exactly the same. So by comparison, comics it's a field day. You can do what you like. It's incredible. But nevertheless, as long as they are recognisable as those characters. And Hasbro were always fairly hands off with Transformers, weren't they? They didn't dictate too much.
I mean, especially with the UK comic, they really didn't pay much attention to what we were doing, which was great, because we could just tell these stories that really sort of wandered completely away from just the toy lines or the sort of limited backstory they had. I mean, and even when we came on to do the American book, it really wasn't in their focus anymore. They'd slightly moved their attention on, so we were able to again do those sort of big sweeping stories that otherwise they might have said, well, no, hang on, we want you focusing on these new Micromaster toys we've got in our range.
Because being a licensed book, I mean, it's essentially an advert for their product. But yeah.
I mean, issue 75 of the US run was our big character cull, I mean, and it does need a character cull. When you've got a cast of 200 or more characters, you desperately need to sort of get rid of some of them and finish some story arcs with some degree of finality. So, I mean, we had a character called Scorponok who had moved through 20 or more issues of the US, and he's kind of, the story was done, and I felt he was somebody who needed killing off. And our big 75th issue, sure enough, we killed him off. The trouble was, I didn't pay attention to who I was killing off. So there were characters I killed off in issue 75 of Generation 1 that I just introduced back in Generation 2 without a thought. I just literally thought, oh, Quake, he's a good character, forgetting that he'd been killed off in issue 75. So it was all fairly fast and loose, in terms of the characters. But yeah, I mean, they needed a cull every now and then. As a writer, it was just more interesting. Again, some of them were so defined or nailed down by what they were doing maybe in the US comic or what people had seen of them. It was great to take these characters that were almost a blank slate. We literally had, sort of characters like Thunderwing and Bludgeon and some of these definitely second tier characters who'd come in later and nothing really had been done with. There wasn't much in their sort of character biographies. There was the odd crumb, one was some kind of master of mystic arts or something, and it was just like they were more or less blank slates, which is just always more interesting for a writer, because you can make them your own. You can actually put your stamp on them, make them something they maybe weren't ever going to be otherwise. And I think that's how it is, especially with characters like Bludgeon, who was a character really who just came and went. I don't think he was even ever a Japanese toy, and as far as the American toy goes, it was a fairly limited release. But now if you look on eBay, he goes for big money, and I take some pride in that. That was more or less down to me. So in that respect, it gives you a great feeling afterwards to think that you've made that character into something it maybe wasn't otherwise.
So you bought up all the stock of Bludgeon toys early on.
I wish I had. I really wish I had.
Turned him into a major player. Yeah.
I mean, I like to think that individually and between us, we've come up with quite a lot over the 20 years. I mean, I've had a hand in most generations of Transformers. I think only skipping Robots in Disguise and Beast Machines. Even then, I think I did some convention comics. So I feel like I've done a little bit almost right across the 20 years of Transformers, and hopefully done some stuff that has actually sort of become part of the mythos, that's become canon. I mean, one of the main things is that I introduced this character called Primus, who was supposed to be the sort of the god of the Transformer race, the original Transformer. And, beforehand, this was just my throwaway character in one of the UK comics. I just threw him in this example of Hasbro not really looking at what we were doing. Here's the god of the Transformers. You didn't know about him, but this is their origin. And so, we just threw that in there. And again, we were very fast and loose in those days. We had no idea that, 15 years later, Hasbro would actually look at this and go, fantastic, we're going to put this into our new cartoon show. And the new cartoon show, Cybertron, which starts, I think, this year in America and next year in the UK, is all around Primus. This character that I created off the cuff into the comic is now actually a part of the Transformers continuity. And, that makes me feel great, to think that I've contributed something that now has sort of come full circle and they're using my character in a way.
But you don't get any money for it.
No,
really sucks.
That's a shame.
In terms of different art styles for the Transformers comic, there isn't a right way. I mean, everybody has their favourite, and I guess to a large degree, I mean, with the UK stuff initially, because they didn't have reference from I think that's right, and they didn't have reference from the Transformers movie at the time, so they were drawing the strips based on what the toys looked like. When the movie reference then came through, obviously there was a very different take on it. But gradually, as is the way with comics, different artists come in and they bring their own thing to the mix, and either the fans like that or they don't. Well, that's fine. I just had a particular take on it, and that was largely down to the fact that I have to put my hands up and say I wasn't particularly interested in Transformers as such. I was very interested in comics, but not particularly as Transformers. So I wasn't necessarily trying to make them look like the movie, which I'd seen, but I hadn't really seen the TV series. So I wasn't trying to in any way ape that at all. I was actually trying to make them look more like superhero characters. That's why the whole organic thing came through, because I had a hankering to draw proper Marvel comics. But that gradually evolved into a kind of a mixture of the two. I then acknowledged that they were robots and just tried to get something that meshed quite well to give. And I like to think that it gave them character, rather than keeping them big and clunky and anonymous. But there you go.
The strange thing about the UK comic was, because we were on a weekly schedule and having to produce 11 pages of artwork a week, we had to have a wide pool of artists. So often you would find in the course of a 6 or 7 part story, you'd end up with maybe 4 or 5 artists, and they were a real eclectic mix. We had, Andrew, who did the more sort of organic human Transformers. We had Dan Reed, who used to draw these wobbly Transformers, not a straight line in sight. They literally used to undulate the limbs. And, we had this wide pool of artists. Jeff Senior's very dynamic, but very stripped down artwork. So there really wasn't a right way to do it. We were just glad we got 11 pages of artwork at the end of the week. So, it was interesting to see how many styles we got. And then how recently the Dreamwave style kind of brought it all together into one reasonably cohesive look and said, no, this is the way Transformers should look. They should be wide across the shoulder. They should be detailed. They should not look like human beings in proportion and the way they moved. So it was like, with fresh eyes, somebody came in and said, there are lots of different ways to do it, but we're going to standardise it here. And when Andrew came on board to draw the Dreamwave style, you did adapt your style, didn't you, to fit?
Yeah, that was quite a decision to make. I remember sitting there with the first page of the first script on War Within 2 and thinking, I don't know how I'm going to approach this. This is like so many years since I drew Transformers, and I was so aware of what Dreamwave had done with it and how they'd created this really cohesive look that everybody liked, that was very manga, very Transformers, really. It had become the look of Transformers. So it's like, well, what do I do? Do I just completely do that, or do I do my own thing? And I spoke to you about it, didn't I? And you said, well, kind of be aware of what the stuff looks like, but you've got to do your own thing in the end. So I did do it the way that I had always done it the only consideration I really made was the proportions of the characters. So to a degree, I kept the organic look of them. Tried to get character in there, but just like Simon was saying, really broad shoulders, smaller heads, big hands, all this kind of thing. And I like to think it worked, but again, these things are, everybody has their own opinion. Some liked it and some really didn't. Yeah, Galvatron was always my favourite character to draw. I mean, early on he was my favourite character to draw because he was the most human-looking character. He'd got a face, fantastic, and he'd got sort of normal limbs, although he'd got this completely ridiculous cannon on his arm, which, how would you scratch your nose with that? I don't know, but he was fun to draw because you could get a lot of expression with him, and because he was not the ultimate bad guy, but in some ways the ultimate bad guy, the amount of expression and insanity you could get into the character was almost limitless. So it wasn't just about expression in his face, it was in his whole body language. He was a real player in the whole thing, and you could really push what was going on. So yeah, he was always my favourite character to draw. Well, Simon was actually a nightmare to work with to start with. I think it was the first British strip that I did for Marvel UK. I'd done loads of other stuff that everybody else was happy with at Marvel UK, and then I did this Transformers story, and I was really happy with the pencils, because the way you do this thing is you draw it up in pencil, and then you send copies into the editor, and for approval, and then if it gets signed off, then it goes to the inker to be inked, and then I got this phone call from Simon, who was the editor. And he just tore it apart. It's quite ruthless, really. And in the end, he was saying things like, "Well, I suppose we can get Stephen to fix it when he inks it." And but I did make changes, and as hard as it is, not to think, what the hell does he know? He's a writer. He's not an artist. I mean, he did know, and once those changes are made, you kind of learn from those experiences, and you think, right, okay, so there's a different way of approaching this next time. So ruthless as it seemed at the time, I kind of learnt a lot from that. Other writers, one of the other writers that I really enjoyed working with was Larry Harmer on the G.I. Joe stuff and a Venom series that I did. Just because he had such a quirky way of writing, which was very hard to get into to start with, but once you'd kind of keyed into the techniques that he was using, it was good. It was good writing, and he was quite an accomplished artist himself as well, so you knew that he had a very, very visual sense when he was writing, so there weren't any questions about whether this stuff was going to work out on the page. You just felt that it automatically did without a problem.
Certainly when we were working together, it was largely just the script was done and it went to Andrew, but sort of you can almost always be pleasantly surprised by what comes back. And I always take a second shot at the dialogue and the story once I've seen the artwork. So often, a character, I mean, not Andrew, but when we introduced the character Death's Head, sort of it was only ever meant to be a sort of throwaway character, and Jeff Senior's drawing of this character was just so great. I just thought, no, I can't just bump this character off. So it kind of inspired me as a writer to make, give him his sort of speech impediments and character nuances that sort of became his trademark. And so yeah, I mean, it's definitely a collaborative medium, comics. Often you can have a minor character or a supporting character who just, once you see the way it's been drawn, becomes sort of, oh yeah, we've got to use that more. And Andrew did it with our superhero group we had in the Generation 1 comic book. Sort of originally they were only ever meant to be a kind of one-shot group, but once Andrew had got hold of them and turned them into, because superheroes was what he wanted to draw, you could tell that in the artwork, and it was just like, no, these are too good to just relegate to one issue.
Yeah, because that was all built around Circuit Breaker, wasn't it? Which was a Bob Budiansky character. Yeah, and then this extra kind of superhero team appeared, and a lot of people didn't like that because it was supposed to be a robot book, and understandably, but we kind of liked it. And after I think it was after Transformers was cancelled. The editor at the time agreed to us pitching it as a book, didn't we?
Yeah.
We redesigned the characters, put it together as a singular concept, and pitched it as a possible new book. And I really think it could have worked, really could have worked, and it had a real kind of metal content to it, not in a kind of Ozzy Osbourne way, but in a all the characters that were in this book were metal related in somehow. So many Marvel guest characters, I don't know, Deathlock and Iron Man and anyone else you could think that vaguely had any kind of metallic property at all. But it was good. It was a good idea, but as was the climate at the time, they weren't taking. But I've still got the piece of concept art I did for the cover somewhere, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Worthless as it is, it means so much to me.
I mean, I generally trust Andrew with pretty much anything. I mean, I know the great thing on working with War Within 2 was that I knew Andrew was going to be drawing it. I tailored as much as possible to Andrew's strengths. I mean, to be honest, there aren't really many areas where I think, well, I must stay away from that because Andrew will make a complete hash of it. So I can't really think of any sort of major drawbacks. I mean, I know, Andrew's not majorly keen on crowd scenes, when there's about sort of 60 robots in a panel. And I still remember in the original series gleefully giving him a double-page spread to draw, which I think it was issue 74, and packed into this spread were about sort of 40 characters, all standing around being addressed by this god character.
Yeah.
And I thought, even as I was writing it, and the paragraph was about this long, and the page the spread must have taken you about sort of 3 days to draw. So that was satisfying.
I rattled it off in 5 minutes. It was all right. It was quite fun doing that, actually. And I just found opportunity to again add little bits of kind of body language and humour into it with all these characters standing there. So yeah, it was quite good fun. But I was just glad he didn't do it too many times. What do I think of Mr. Furman? Well, it's like this. No, I think interestingly, as I was saying earlier about the fact that we had the first bit of work that I did for Marvel UK, where Simon kind of ruthlessly but very professionally ripped into what I'd done. We actually cleared a lot of space by doing that right from the kickoff, and we knew exactly what each other was about, what we could do, what we couldn't do, and from then on, I think it just meant that we were kind of open about stuff if we just thought each other was not doing it right. But I mean, Simon's just so kind of focused on writing this stuff that why would I have any kind of problem with it? I'm not a writer. What do? I just draw pictures.
Apparently, as an editor back then, I had this habit that I didn't really realise myself of when I was on the phone to a freelancer like Andrew, where if I had pages in front of me that had been submitted, I would go through all the positive things. I really like that. Oh, that was fabulous. Yeah. And then it would reach a point where there was this clanging but, and it would then lapse into a sort of complete sort of tearing apart and shredding of their self-respect. And apparently, sort of they listened to the other end of my conversation with Andrew, and apparently everyone was just sort of wincing and leaving the office. But generally I found that it, as a tactic, it worked, most of the time pretty well, because it just got you on the right foot straight away.
There are quite a few kind of artists who were exceptionally good who we've never seen again. No, I think the thing is you can choose to learn from those experiences or not. If you don't learn from those experiences, then that's kind of your choice. But if you do, then your work improves. So. The other mediums that I've worked in, other than comics, bits of storyboarding for advertising and movies, not a lot, but just a little bit, which was fun to do. And then, like I say, lots of design work for a computer games company. And then more latterly, designing characters for kids animated TV shows, which I really enjoy working in animation. It's similar to comics, but it's a slightly different discipline. And I always think of it as the thing I could have done. At one point in my career it was going to be comics or animation, and I chose comics, but now I'm having the chance to do the other thing that I didn't do. But the whole Wildfur setup originally was done because we had so many ideas that we were generating at a time when the comic book industry was really downscaling and nobody was picking up on new stuff. So we thought, well, what's a way that we can express the ideas we've got? And the internet was the obvious example. So the first of those ideas to go on the internet was the engine, and we've had a degree of success with the engine. Built up a nice little core fan base with it, animated episodes online, selling bits and pieces of merchandise at conventions. But what the engine is an example of for Wildfur is our whole kind of product development ourselves that we can then move through to the industry. So we're talking to production companies about the possibilities of the engine and a couple of other ideas that we've got. So there's a lot to be done with Wildfur, and a lot of opportunities out there, because there are more outlets out there now than there were 10, 15 years ago.
I mean, we've got a few strands to the Wildfur bow. I mean, we've got the actual sort of bread and butter stuff, like the engine, which is our own development of IPs or intellectual properties that we can then hopefully market into other fields, other arenas, computer games, TV. So we've got that whole side of it. We've got a publishing side where we do mini comics. We did one for the recent Atari Transformers game. So we're a bit of a publishing company. We're a bit of an IP development company, and what we're doing increasingly is develop intellectual properties for other companies. They're coming to us and looking for development, the know-how that we've got, which is like 20 years each of us in comics and TV animation and computer games. And we're actually sort of literally taking things from the ground, the nuts and bolts up, and putting them together into fully realised style guides, Bibles. And it's great because it's actually sort of you're hands on with the creation of whole lines here, which is great. For me, it was always Stan Lee. I grew up on a steady diet of Stan Lee, early Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Avengers, and I just loved the kind of pompous overblownness of his dialogue and the action. It was all just so dramatic.
That's where you get it from.
Two characters having a cup of tea was somehow really dramatic and monumental, and the fate of the universe is sort of rested on it. He just had a great style. And it was really inspirational stuff. I would read his Fantastic Fours and think, what an imagination to come up with Galactus and the Silver Surfer and the Inhumans in about 3 months. These were bang, one after the other, bang, 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 these amazing characters. And you look at all those characters, and from that Stan Lee era, there's not that many characters after Stan Lee was writing that have become these icons. You look at all of the ones that have stood the test of time that are being made into movies. They were all created by Stan Lee. I mean, he just had this amazing grasp of what made an interesting character, what drew you into the character as opposed to just the action. I mean, there was this big split at the time between the DC comics, which were largely just Superman turns up, defeats Lex Luthor, Lois Lane narrowly misses finding out who he is. That encapsulated most Superman stories at the time. And then you got these Marvel comics starting up where you had sort of Spider-Man, who was this nerdy college student with problems and getting picked on, and it was just fabulous. And you just thought, this is how they've changed comics. They've given you character story arcs, characters that you care about. And I think that always followed on into my work, that you had to care about the characters. And that character, even per issue, had to go through an arc, had to go through some kind of character development that made you think, they're slightly different character to the one they were on page 1. And that's kind of what I've tried to carry through into Transformers, that no matter how big and sprawling this war gets, you focus on maybe 1 or 2 characters and you take them through the sort of, basically conflict resolution, sort of next step of character development arc each time, and then you turn the focus on another one.
In terms of art influences, again, I guess the same Simon's been influenced by Stan Lee, I suppose. Well, Jack Kirby, I don't know. I kind of always liked Jack Kirby, and I appreciate him more now than I did then. I wouldn't say he was an influence, But John Buscema definitely was a huge influence, and still is a huge influence on what I do. And then Barry Smith, Neil Adams, a few others, and then you can't deny the influence of Jim Lee. I mean, he was a huge influence on comics generally. I'd nail it down to those really. I think I really, and then the other major influence is cinema. That kind of feeds so much into what you do and how you frame things, how you pace things, and the angles you choose.
I mean, I would, just to add to that, that when we were in the very early days of Marvel UK and we were doing our Transformers comics, we had a couple of sort of visitations, if you like, from Marvel US. The editor-in-chief, first Jim Shooter and then Tom DeFalco, paid these sort of visits to the Marvel offices, more or less to kick us into shape. It was very much a kind of, this is the Marvel way of doing comics. And I found that immensely helpful because they managed, both of them, to boil it down into the sort of the bare essentials of what a Marvel comic, doesn't have to be, but generally, but what a Marvel comic should be in terms of each single issue entity and literally the construction of an issue and how it should flow and how panels on a page should lead you through the issue, and it was a great grounding for me in just comics generally. So I mean, I must tip my hat to them as well. I mean, I think there'll always be comics. I mean, the strange thing in the early 90s was there was this strange speculators market in comics where people were buying multiple copies because they thought there was a resale value afterwards. And so it just artificially inflated the whole industry. Suddenly comics were selling, 1 million or 2 million or even 5 million in one case, I think.
8.2 million in X-Men 1.
And, and it just sort of suddenly, it went mad and the expectations got so big. And then, of course, when the speculation boom finished, whoomph, that was the end, the bubble burst. And it dropped back to a level far below what it had used to be. It just... I think it had just got unwieldy. A lot of rubbish, to be honest, was being produced just to sort of get X number of titles out there. And I just think it damaged the industry, and only now really is it starting to at least hit a level and a pace and a beat again, even if it's a much smaller market. But I think they'll always be around. I mean, computer games were going to ruin the comics industry, and that didn't happen. And sort of whatever else was going to sort of cancel out comics, graphic novels were going to cancel out the need for a comic book. But the financial realities of that make it impossible just to do original graphic novels all the time. A company couldn't do it. So comic books will always be around, I think.
What was the question?
The state of the industry and where you think it's all going and having been a participant in it.
Yeah, I mean it did really hit a difficult time in the sort of mid-90s, and it was difficult for the industry. It was difficult for all the freelancers like ourselves that were working in it. I mean, that's when we both did in different ways, but I took a conscious decision to move out of comics. That's when I started doing bits of storyboarding, and then I started working with a computer games company because there just didn't seem to be anywhere to go with it. But as Simon says, it's always going to be there. There's always going to be product. It's just whether you want to make yourself relevant to that product or not. But we kind of felt wounded and retired and licked our wounds. But then, you come back and you do more stuff. And because of the history of this stuff, people do actually, as comic veterans, they kind of respect the work that you have done, and that's nice to think that people are aware of that. But I think you do get to the point that, for me, I got to a point where I never wanted to really do anything. I was interested in animation, but comics was the thing I always wanted to do. Well, having done that for so many years, you do reach a point, maybe circumstances dictate that, or sometimes you come to that realization yourself, but you get to a point where you think, well, maybe there's other things I can do anyway, and you don't have to move. You can move on feeling positive about things rather than thinking, well, that all ended badly, didn't it? But and it was. Computer games was good, animation's fantastic, and the stuff that we're doing together is really good. So who knows?
I mean, for me, it was a wake-up call when it all sort of went pear-shaped in the mid-90s. Or, you know, I literally had all my eggs in one basket. I was just doing comics work, just for Marvel, more or less. And so when, you know, Marvel suddenly contracted and they were giving the work largely to local people, there was just no work there. And you know, what it taught me really was just to diversify, to get into other fields. You know, I've done audio CDs, I've done a couple of Doctor Who audio CDs, I've done a lot of animation work, I've done some prose work, I've done some editing for Titan books. So, you know, it just made it clear that I couldn't just be a comics writer. I mean, I think the strength of Transformers is that as a concept, it's so easy to reinvent itself for the next generation. You know, it is a concept whereby, you know, they can more or less either just take what they've got and change it a little bit or restart the whole thing. So I think, you know, it's always got that longevity because they can change it, make it current, make it interesting, exciting to a new sort of level of kids that are coming in, but also keep the existing fans happy. It's this fine balance that they've got that I think really is why it's kept going on. They're sort of loyal to the fans who've stayed with it for 20 years, but they're also opening the door all the time to a new sort of readership or viewing audience. So, you know, I mean, I think that's why it's good, because it just can reinvent itself so easily. And it's at core, right, when you strip it right down, it's just such a no-brainer of a concept for a toy. It's like two toys in one. I mean, how good is that?
It is a very basic idea for a toy. Yeah, two toys in one. It's fantastic. You know, value for money. But the whole fact that it can be reinvented and regenerated all the time just perpetuates the license. And I think once you get to the point that they have now with Transformers, and other things have done the same, but with Transformers, whereby the people who were buying it, playing with it, reading it, watching it when it first started, now have kids of their own. So that very basic idea of a robot vehicle, plane thing, toy, whatever, if other versions of that come along, if the parent's the one with the buying power, then they're going to choose Transformers, aren't they? Because they like it. So it begins to kick into some, like say, some kind of longevity purely because you've reached the next generation. And as long as they can keep reinventing the toys and making them cool as well, then I can't see any reason why it would finish at all.
I think the thing, if I was going to pick one thing that I put in, was just not looking at them as robots at all. You know, I mean, I started off really just thinking of them as robots, and the stories seemed to be fairly sort of clunky and rigid as well. But as soon as you stop thinking about them as robots and just ascribe human characteristics, human frailties, human strengths, human character to them, you get this, you know, sort of you just get into the realm of pure storytelling and character development. And I think that was when it was a sort of renaissance for me with Transformers, that really I forgot about them as toys, I forgot about them as robots, and just started sculpting characters. You know, Grimlock is my kind of case in point, whereby the actual character was fairly dull. You know, he was just this monosyllabic, slightly sort of dense character. And I thought, well, no, there's got to be more to him than that. I don't buy that. I don't buy that at all. You know, he's this marvel of robotic evolution, and he just grunts and says, "Me, Grimlock." And so it became a challenge, and a kind of personal challenge all the way through Transformers, to kind of pull out the real character from this sort of almost stereotypical quick fix, here's a dinosaur, so he must be stupid kind of, you know, method of ascribing characteristics. And just, you know, right the way through, I've tried to give it that sort of real human touch.
Well, apart from teeth and eyeballs and all that kind of stuff,
and toasters.
Yeah, I mean, that all that kind of ephemera, whatever, the kind of bits and stuff that I'd like to put into it, which so that it's not just Transformers and not just robots in a robot world. I mean, I liked it to bring some kind of humour to it, I think. And so in the back, as I've told many times before, in the background of so many of the panels, there are metal-related things. So there will be toasters and vacuum cleaners and like screwdrivers and spanners lying on the floor, and just stuff. Just, you know, put it all in there because it in a small way, it adds to the world, and it adds a bit of humour as well. So I really enjoyed doing all that, and I like the fact that other people appreciated that and just saw it as a little bit of visual humour. So that's kind of what you take from it. What I take from it, as much as anything, is the enormous satisfaction that people still remember all that stuff, and it doesn't get any better than that, really.
I mean, the other thing Andrew does and did very well in those days was, once robots got damaged, he would follow that through, so that, you know, sort of what we lacked often was that kind of continuity where, you know, somebody would take a bit of collateral damage and then in the panel or two miraculously it disappeared or it moved to the other leg or whatever. But where Andrew, particularly on the US run, you know, there was one fight, I think, between a kind of melded together Ratchet Megatron creature and Optimus Prime, and bits were falling off, you know, great segments of leg were dropping off, arms, shoulders, and it followed through very accurately through the whole issue.
That was a bit sad, really, wasn't it? But I love that whole continuity thing, because it flowed you through the story. I mean, you know, if you're doing this stuff, you've got to make it as real as possible. It's all completely made up nonsense, really, but you've got to make it real because people are into it and they're enjoying it. So make it as real as you possibly can. So yeah, bits would fall off, and you'd try and pinpoint that continuity for as long as you possibly could, not just within one issue, but into the next issue if necessary, and then maybe find a point at which you could possibly say that they managed to get repaired, and then they'd be back to new, but only if you found a point that they could repair. I did the same in G.I. Joe as well. There was a particular scene where the version of Snake Eyes that they were using at the time had like this kind of, I don't know, quilted bulletproof vest thing on, and he was caught in an explosion and like thrown across the ground or whatever, and the straps over the shoulders, I just made them both broken. So in one panel they were just like hanging down, and then I did it so that he tied them in knots on the top, and for the whole rest of the run these things on it, they were just knotted on his shoulders. And it's like, well, life's like that, isn't it? So why not put it in a comic? Why does it deserve any less? So.
I mean, I took away a lot of work, which is great. You know, I mean, not just on Transformers, but like I say, it kept opening doors for me. And so, you know, 20 years on, it's still paying bills and opening new doors. So, you know, I'm just very grateful to be known as the guy who wrote Transformers.
Yeah, Mr. Transformers. It was a great book to cut your teeth on. You know, you've got to find one to really work out what it is you do and how you do it. And Transformers was a really good one, because it gave you the opportunity to. They are characters, okay, they're robots, but they are characters. You still need that sense of continuity. You still got to get all the composition, everything, but you've also inherently got the opportunity to hone your skills at drawing vehicles and buildings and spaceships and whatever. There was so much stuff in there that you could learn how to do. So it was a great book to cut your teeth on and learn your trade.